Tetairoa McMillan is the number one receiver in the 2025 draft, but should he be? We'll tell you on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. On today's show, we are taking a look at Arizona wide receiver Tetairoa McMillan. We're going to call him T-Mac because he does not like to be called Tet, Kate. So T-Mac.
Lessons learned.
Which we've learned. What did you see when you turned on the tape?
Tetairoa McMillan is one of the most fun prospects to watch. Now, I'm just going to say, like in this class, he's definitely by far and away, depending on whether or not you're counting Travis Hunter as a cornerback or a wide receiver, like it does feel like he's really running away with that wide receiver one stance, despite not competing at the NFL Combine. But T-Mac coming out of Arizona, he's a third-year wide receiver, junior, former four-star recruit, 6'4", 219 pounds, big hands, 10-inch honkers, 10-inch. We love some big hands, and it complements his play style perfectly because where he wins is with his size, his body control, and his play strength to kind of overpower some of these NFL cornerbacks to make splash play after splash play.
Yeah, you could turn on the tape and see him going up against Travis Hunter multiple times. He plays really well in both those games. And you can see he can just be overwhelming for these corners because he's so big. But one of the things I like about him compared to some other receivers, like Quentin Johnson, who went in the first round a couple of years ago, is that he plays big. And I know that sounds weird. Like, yeah, if you're a big receiver, shouldn't you play big? No, that's not always the case. There are a lot of times you get these 6'3", 6'4" receivers, and they want to play like a 6-foot guy, where I think T-Mac does a great job of using his body to shield defenders, but he doesn't let the ball get into his chest. He does a great job of extending his hands out, making it impossible for the cornerbacks to knock the ball away. He plays really big, and he presents a big target for quarterbacks. And I think that's why so many teams are going to like him, because it's going to be so easy on 3rd and 4 to throw him a slant and know that he's going to catch it and know that he's going to fall forward and get you a couple extra yards. There's a lot about his game that I do like.
Yeah, really reliable hands, like you mentioned, like the play strength component for T-Mac is really significant. You do have plenty of players that, can technically have the size, but maybe don't use their body. And I think body control is probably the biggest aspect of what makes his size so physically domineering for opposing cornerbacks. But you mentioned the strength in the hands too. And I think that's a big component because T-Mac can just pluck the ball straight out of the air. And that's part of what makes him so reliable a target for his quarterback. Now, we talk strength, ideal size, never lets that ball into his body, great body control. Let's talk about some of the weaknesses here because he's not absolutely perfect.
No.
What did you see in his game that maybe wasn't perfect? What does he have to work on at the next level?
So I think he is a good athlete, but I don't think he's a great athlete. And I think that's part of the reason he didn't test at the NFL Combine is that I think there was a chance, Kate, that he was going to run maybe in the upper 4.5s, maybe even in the low 4.6s. And you see that on tape. Like he can make plays down the field, but he's not pulling away from anybody, right? In that way, he reminds me a little bit of Mike Evans, like this current Mike Evans, not the Mike Evans we saw at Texas A&M in the first couple of years, where he can make these big plays, but a lot of the times it's going to be contested. And I think that's the big concern if you're drafting T-Mac early in the NFL draft is that just everything is going to be contested. And for young quarterbacks that are playing with these type of receivers, it can be really hard to throw into tight windows all the time. This is where I think he would actually benefit from playing with a veteran quarterback that knows how to throw the ball in the right spots to make sure that the defender doesn't get it. And then you see somebody who I think is okay after the catch. I think he does a good job of catching the ball, sinking his hips, and getting upfield. But this isn't somebody that you need to be worried about after the catch. Again, he's a big target that also gives defenders a big body to try to tackle. So he's more of a go up and get it and fall down type of receiver. Those guys usually don't end up going inside the top 10 of the draft. They usually fall a little bit. And that's the concern, is if he's not a great athlete and he's not great after the catch and everything's going to be contested, maybe he does fall a little bit when we get to April.
And I think we're seeing that in general when we're looking at some of the mock drafts maybe coming out of the combine. There weren't a ton of clear-cut winners coming out of the NFL combine. Matthew Golden, wide receiver out of Texas, he was probably the biggest winner because he really surprised. I think when people put on the tape compared to the 4.29 that he ran in the 40-yard dash, like that's the kind of performance that's going to win you a little something. But we didn't have any, I think, single wide receiver just earn a ton of draft stock outside of Matthew Golden here when it came to the NFL combine, at least at the top of, the consensus wide receiver ranking. So he didn't test. That didn't necessarily, I think change things for him. I still think he's probably.
Well, can I push back on that a little bit?
Yeah.
We saw the consensus board ranking like in January and February. He was like 5 or 6 overall. And now you start to look at like some mock drafts that are coming out after the combine. And now he's starting to fall to 12. I saw a mock today where he fell to Pittsburgh at 21. I do think you're starting to see him a little bit. I'm not saying that the testing hurt him, but not testing, I think, maybe boosted a couple players ahead of him. And now we just have questions about Tet, right? Like, okay, how fast are you really? Are you hiding your 4.6 speed? Why didn't you do any of the jumps? And it doesn't sound like he's going to do any 40-yard dash at his pro day either, which is a little concerning. And when you get to the top 10, top 12 picks in the draft, these teams want to be certain that they're getting like a special athlete. And I just don't think T-Mac is one of those, but I don't think it, for his sake, I don't know if it matters all that much because we know that he's not a special athlete and he's still posted monster numbers for back-to-back seasons at Arizona.
And that's, I think, what I don't think is too surprising for him because it's not like you watch the tape and you think he looks like a spectacular athlete. No, he looks like, a power wide receiver who wins with body control, not by creating separation because of his his technique as a route runner. I think he has some room to grow there at the next level in terms of just his manipulation of defenders based on his body movement rather than just being physically domineering. Like, I think those are things to look at. But I still think all of the wide receivers, I feel like are just, the combine, I think, made it clear that like this isn't a great wide receiver class, which we already knew. But let's talk about his production because I think that's part of what makes T-Mac so special. Coming out of Arizona, 3 seasons of pretty stellar production, 8+ receiving touchdowns in each of his 3 seasons. We saw Arizona play in the Pac-12 for the first 2 seasons that T-Mac was with the team, moved to the Big 12. So had 2, had production in 2 different Big 5 or Power 5 conferences, led the Pac-12 in yards per reception as a true freshman. Like,
that's the one that, to me, honestly, of all the numbers, if you're watching with us on YouTube right now, posting 700 yards and averaging 18 yards per catch, scoring 8 touchdowns as a freshman. And I believe he was 18. He might've been almost 18 and a half during that season. That's the number for me.
It's ridiculous. And I think that speaks to, the type of player you get that has a potential for immediate impact the second he steps onto the NFL field. I think he's going to be an absolute dog in the red zone. I think he's going to be a guy that, like you said, maybe is going to be a little bit more compatible with a quarterback that's experienced, that has just kind of an innate trust level once they build that chemistry with their wide receivers. Sometimes we'll see younger quarterbacks just not be as willing to take some of those shots that I think are going to be big in terms of T-Mac's overall NFL game.
I want to talk about the analytics, and we're going to get to that here in segment 2. But before we do that, I did want to mention that he had an ankle injury that he suffered like in training camp this year, and that's why the numbers weren't quite as good as they were as a sophomore. He still put up 1,300 yards. So it wasn't like he was unproductive.
Yeah,
but I
he's
think
not a bum, but yeah.
No, I think people were expecting him to take a leap. And I think that ankle injury limited him quite a bit. And you can watch the 2023 tape compared to the 2024 tape and just see him be a lot more athletic. But, Kate, I want to talk about where you would rank T-Mac in last year's class, which was a great receiver class. How does he stack up compared to those receivers? We'll dive into the analytics as well. We'll do that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or just want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my favorite team to win or picking a player to make a clutch 3 at the end of the game. I never feel like I miss my chance. Plus, the app is so easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That is FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets, and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Okay, we're going to dive into the analytics, but just really quickly, how would you stack up T-Mac in last year's wide receiver class that had Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, Brian Thomas, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey? Like, where does he rank for you among that group?
If we were going back to like the pre-draft rankings and we had them all in the same class, he would be my wide receiver 4 ahead of Brian Thomas Jr. Retrospectively, he would be wide receiver 5 behind Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, and Brian Thomas Jr. Does that feel about right?
100%. That's where maybe we were just too low on Brian Thomas, and we were all too low on Brian Thomas because he might be the best receiver of the bunch, but that's kind of where I view him as well.
Yeah. And last year wasn't necessarily a knock on Brian Thomas Jr. for me. I had Ladd McConkey as my wide receiver 4 over Brian Thomas Jr. And a big part of that was just kind of the question about how much of it is, tall man run fast versus how much room he had to grow at the next level in terms of his ability as route runner, etc. He answered all those questions. I look like a fool. But again, like Ladd McConkey, you can't complain about Ladd McConkey either. So I think that just speaks to the strengths of the 2024 NFL draft class at the wide receiver position, that T-Mac would fall as far as he did. Like if we're ranking these classes back to back, his standing as low as it is for a guy who I really like, a lot of fun watching. Reminds me a lot of Mike Evans in the way that they win. Yeah, I think that says a little something about just how special 2024 was.
All right, let's dive into the analytics. Again, I'm going to assume the analytic profile here is pretty good. What does it say?
It's pretty good. Now, you mentioned the fact that, his early breakout was impressive. 19.4 breakout age, that ranked in the 79th percentile. So breakout age, that is the age at the start of the season where a player first posted a dominator rating at or above 20%. Now, dominator rating is a combined percentage of a team's total receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. His dominator rating this year, 44.4%. That's in the 91st percentile for wide receivers, 30.9% target share. He was the Arizona offense. And I think that kind of speaks to the type of player he is. And the advanced metrics, Marcus, tell us about where he ranks in terms of his like advanced
Yeah.
percentiles for PFF.
Yeah, and they're all pretty good. 89th percentile receiving grade, 74th percentile separation percentage, which actually is better than you would think for a receiver of his size. 86th percentile contested catch percentage. Again, he's going to be in a lot of contested catch stuff because of just his body type. But being able to be that consistent when it comes to making contested catches is really good. Now, the one stat here that's a little concerning is yards after the catch per reception, 48th percentile. That's below average for college football receivers. It's going to be well below average once you get into the NFL. But some of this is usage based. When you're an outside receiver and playing in contested catch situations, a lot of times you're just going up and making the catch and falling to the ground, right? So there's not a lot of opportunities to make plays after the catch. But I could see, Kate, a situation where he's playing more inside as like a big slot or in some of these condensed formations and making plays after the catch. We saw somebody like George Pickens at Georgia. He was the worst in the country at making plays after the catch. And then in 2023 was one of the best in the NFL at making plays after the catch per reception. So usage can change that number a little bit, but this is not somebody that's winning after the catch. That's just not.
It's not
his
a skill
strength.
set, and
No,
that's
it's
not
not.
like
You're not drafting him to do that.
no. And but I think that's part of like you needing to be honest with yourself about what kind of player he is and how he fits into, if I'm an NFL GM, how does he fit into my respective offense? If I need a yards after the catch guy, T-Mac's not your guy. And I think that's pretty obvious just because, again, when you look at the 40-yard dash time, he's a big wide receiver. He's very long. He's big bodied, almost 220 pounds. You're not usually expecting those guys to run super fast 40-yard dash. That just usually isn't conducive for that kind of body type to move in that way, which is why when players do, it's super, super special. But I just think I feel very comfortable with, the kind of evaluation of who T-Mac is as a player. And that's not the guy. So like, it depends on what you're looking for. Are you looking for somebody who can kind of dominate? I think he'd be really fun in, a physical situation where he can kind of get into it a little bit with opposing cornerbacks. Maybe we can recreate some, Marshawn Lattimore, Mike Evans situations with some of that physical type of play. He's going to be a fun dude to watch, but I just don't think that anybody watching T-Mac's tape is going to complain that he's not producing after the catch, because that's just not what he's been asked to do.
Let's talk about some landing spots here, because I think his range starts at 4 with the Patriots. That feels a little high to me. I don't think he'll go to the Patriots. One team I've heard that does like him a little bit is Jacksonville. And if you're thinking of like Liam Cohen, who was with Tampa Bay, who had Baker Mayfield and Chris Godwin, maybe the idea of having Brian Thomas Jr. and T-Mac together is like, hey, let's give Trevor Lawrence all the weapons he needs. We're going to give him 2 massive weapons. Both these guys can win contested catches. Thomas gives you the more athleticism. T-Mac is the underneath guy. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the Panthers at 8 could be an option. I think the Raiders at 6 are an option. And then we saw today 2 different mock drafts, one from ESPN's Jordan Reed, one from Dane Brugler at The Athletic, had the Cowboys picking McMillan at 12. I know that's somebody the Cowboys have on their short list of names that they would consider. I have a hard time thinking he gets outside the top 12 picks, but those are just a couple of teams that I'm having my eye on with him.
And which of those would be your favorite fit for the dynasty value of T-Mac?
I don't love the fit with Dallas in terms of his dynasty value, because he's always going to cede targets to CeeDee Lamb, right? So I think he could be a useful player there, but I don't think this is like Chase, Burrow, and Higgins, right? I don't think it's like that. Jacksonville, same thing. I think if it's Brian Thomas Jr. getting all these deep targets, I don't love that. Probably my favorite, Kate, would be like the Patriots at 4, just because I don't think there's another option in the passing game that's anywhere close to him. No. I like Drake May. I could see a world in which T-Mac gets 100 targets as a rookie, maybe even more than that, 120.
I think that would be a really interesting pairing, especially because Drake May, obviously coming out of the 2024 class, was super young, had a lot of, I think, growth to undergo. Now, where I see the biggest issue there is just with the Patriots and their big need on the offensive
I
line.
know.
That's the kicker there, and they might have some options there for that they'd prefer just to secure their front line here instead of investing in the playmakers. But I mean, I feel like we could have the same debate. Like, remember when the Bengals were talking about drafting Penei Sewell or Jamar Chase, right? It's almost like the same debate. We got Jamar Chase, and it's worked out.
Yeah.
So I think any of these options, but I would love to see him go to a place where he can get that full wide receiver one target share. But I will say, in terms of the fit with the Jaguars specifically, I think it is a little bit more interesting because we have a quarterback that I think is capable of supporting two receiving options in the passing game. You have a head coach who's worked with a player that I think has a very similar play style and skill set to Mike Evans. And again, you have a very different skill set in terms of the athleticism. Like, you could not think of two polar opposite players that,
Nope.
T-Mac, he's got the 6'4", 220-pound frame. Brian Thomas Jr., 6'4", very different body type, very different play style. So in that regard, I think T-Mac with the Jaguars could kind of work just because of how different he is from
It's true.
the Brian Thomas Jr. archetype. And I think they could play very different roles in the offense.
Let's talk about his current dynasty value and give our player comps for Tetairoa McMillan. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft Show with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every single day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. All right, Kate, let's talk about some player comps. I always ask you, I want you to go first. Do you have a comp for McMillan?
In case you didn't catch on to it in segment 2, I'm going with Mike Evans because when I'm watching the ways that they win and the good things that they do, T-Mac wins with length, play strength, jump ball abilities, looks like a basketball player out there. Reminds me so much of Mike Evans and his specific skill set. But another comp that I've heard quite often, and I think is a pretty reasonable one, is Drake London, a wide receiver who finally got a quarterback this year, hopefully. And I think, people are thinking this could be the year we see Drake London meet his potential, but kind of these big bodied receivers that can win in jump ball situations that I think, we're expecting literal big things from.
And I've seen a lot of different comps between like Nico Collins. I've seen Michael Pittman as a comp, and actually, I think Michael Pittman's more to the low end, but I can see the Michael Pittman one a little bit. He reminds me a little bit of Mike Williams when Mike Williams was good for the Chargers, like this vertical downfield threat, but doesn't blow you away with speed. But he's just so big, and he does such a good job of tracking the ball and using his hands. But to me, the comp is Tee Higgins. Higgins, I think, is a 4'6" athlete. Big and not just like tall, but actually like big muscle type. Is a good route runner, but not a great route runner. But they use their hands to snatch the ball out of the air. They've got great ball tracking. I don't know if Higgins would be a wide receiver one on every team, but you put him with the right quarterback in the right offense, and he can be deadly. Like, he can just destroy single teams. And that's kind of what I think about McMillan. I think he's somebody that could really benefit from going to a team with a good quarterback that knows how to get him the football. I think Tee Higgins is my favorite comp from my size athleticism standpoint.
I love that comp, especially, and it's one I actually haven't seen before. So that I am very intrigued by that because I do think the skill set's pretty comparable. And T-Mac again kind of has that bigger body type that is going to physically win in those situations. And like you mentioned, Tee Higgins, maybe not a wide receiver one on every single NFL team,
No.
but a wide receiver one on most teams, I would say. More than half of NFL teams, Tee Higgins would be a bona fide wide receiver one. And I think that's probably the case with T-Mac in terms of his dynasty value. Now, we talked about where T-Mac would fall in the rankings when we combined the 2024 and 2025 draft class. Feels like consensus would be if all of these guys were in one giant pile together, let's pretend I'm back in 2024, he'd probably be wide receiver 5 or wide receiver 4, somewhere in that range. Where does he fall in the grand scheme of things for you when you're evaluating his overall value in maybe a startup draft?
I think he goes somewhere for me for like wide receiver 15 to wide receiver 22, like that range outside the top 12. I'm not convinced he's going to be the top receiver from this class. We'll save that for a different podcast. So that's part of the reason for me. I want to see the fit, but I think he's somebody that, yeah, you're valuing him as a lower end wide receiver 2 right now because of the age, because of the size. But I think that can move a little bit depending on the landing spot. But yeah, I think in that George Pickens range.
Okay, so I'm going to name you some players, and I just want you to say this player or T-Mac. Okay. Ladd McConkey.
Ladd.
Jackson Smith and Jigba.
JSN.
Tee Higgins.
McMillan.
Rashee Rice.
McMillan.
I know you love Rashee Rice.
I do.
But circumstantially, I mean, you got to admit.
McMillan.
Yeah. Okay. Devonta Smith.
McMillan.
Rome Odunze.
Rome.
Okay. So I think you're looking at like your overall evaluation of him somewhere at literally right at wide receiver 15 when we're looking at some of the latest dynasty startup ADP. That's the range that feels pretty appropriate for him. I think given just the general question marks, like I wouldn't feel comfortable ranking him ahead of a 27-year-old AJ Brown, who, yes, is older than T-Mac, but we know exactly what we're getting. Marvin Harrison Jr., yeah, I know didn't have the best rookie season, but he's 22 years old and the better prospect overall. Garrett Wilson, I think, is one of maybe the more interesting names in that range.
Wilson, easily.
Yeah, I think that feels about right for this player. And I think that's where we're going to kind of see him settle, regardless of landing spot, probably after this draft.
And again, in your rookie drafts, your super flex rookie drafts, I just posted an article today on the 33rd team, and I had him going, I believe, 4 or 5. I think you're going to have Ashton Genty, Cam Ward, Amarian Hampton at 3. And then I think that's when you get into the McMillan conversation, whether you want to take him over like a Travion Henderson or a Quinshon Judkins, Caleb Johnson, Shedeur Sanders. I think if you're like pick 4, 5, 6, I think that's where you're in the range for McMillan. But again, that's all dependent on where he lands because Kate, weirdly enough, this is a draft where a lot of the teams inside like the top 12 all have wide receiver ones, whether it's like the Cowboys with CeeDee Lamb, the 49ers with Ayuk, the Bears have 2, DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, the Jets have Garrett Wilson, the Jags have Brian Thomas Jr. So like there aren't a lot of natural landing spots where he could come in and be the wide receiver 1 right away, which makes this so fascinating. But if I had to bet today, I do think he ends up being the first receiver drafted, assuming we're not counting Travis Hunter as a receiver.
Yeah, I think that's fair. In the first edition of Dynasty rookie ADP for Superflex drafts, T-Mac went 3rd off the board. And this was over a sample of 10 rookie drafts, Ashton Genty, Cam Ward, and then T-Mac there at 3, just ahead of Shedeur Sanders, Amarian Hampton, Travion Henderson. So I think you're probably right in that range. 4 probably seems like the right spot. That was the most common place that he was drafted over these first 10 rookie drafts that we're sampling from.
Yep.
Went as high as 2 in 3 separate drafts. So like I But again, Cam Ward, Shador Sanders,
I
that
know,
might
they're
be a
gonna
situation where we see them rise or fall based on their landing spots as
correct.
well.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. Download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosier, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.